Hello and welcome. We will get started very shortly. Thanks. All right, well, let's begin. We have more expected to join, and we'll let them into the meeting room here as they come. So welcome to this webinar. Our topic today is around resilience beyond the technology. And resilience can mean different things to different audiences. If resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, then on a personal level, it can refer to the ability to bounce back from life's trials and tribulations. To a business, resilience could mean surviving industry shifts or confronting a cyber attack. Either way, resilience entails the ability to accept the fear of change while taking bold leaps to recover rather than getting trapped in paralysis. Regardless of how you view resilience, it's vital that any individual, an organization, or community take steps to face disruptions with the courage to embrace a resolution, looking for opportunity in the face of adversity. And this often takes the form of planning, training, consulting with others to formulate a response in case the worst should happen. And we all know it is not a matter of if, but when you will need to test your resilience. And given these uncertain times, what business and tech leaders need to know to ensure their organizations are as resilient as possible. How can business resilience help your company gain a competitive advantage? What are advanced firms doing and how they're differentiating themselves to gain market share? So good day, everyone, and welcome. My name is Brian Fawcett. I'm a senior manager for global sales engagement at Sungard Availability Services, and I would like to welcome you to our roundtable discussion, Resilience Beyond the Technology. Today, we're joined by Naveen Chhabra. He is a senior analyst with Forrester. We have Girish Dadge and Mickey Schneebel. They are senior leaders of Sungard Availability Services Global Cloud Recovery Product Team. And our discussion today focuses on what it means for organizations to be adaptive and resilient. We'll talk about IT resilience and what role does a service provider play in an organization's business resilience success. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. We will be taking live questions during the session. Feel free to ask your questions through the chat function if you'd like in Teams. If you would like to ask your question live, please raise your hand. There's a little icon at the top of your screen that you can raise your hand virtually in the Teams toolbar. And at the right time, we'll call on you and you can ask the panel your question live. One final note, today's session is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be available to you after the session. So let's get right into it, and welcome, gentlemen, to this roundtable discussion. Let me start, and Naveen, I'll ask the question to you first. What have been some experiences around business resiliency and the learnings over the past year?
Thank you, Brian. First of all, thanks for having me here. And I think that's a great question to kind of start with in today's volatile and uncertain world where firms are facing increasing volume and velocity of business risks. Now, before we go further, I think it is important to develop a common and a shared understanding of what we mean by business resilience. So basically defining what that is. And in the last year at Forrester, we took a stab at defining what business resilience means. And quite simplistically, it is the ability of an organization to deliver on its vision and brand promise, no matter what the crisis. So thinking about that, um, a resilient firm or a resilient business would be able to shift its business model, manufacturing processes, customer engagement, and so on and so forth when specific market factors, business risks kind of play out. And we have seen in the last year and a half, many firms were caught off guard when COVID-19 abruptly shuttered many or almost all the brick and mortar businesses and sent workers home in massive. I here want to point out that COVID-19 is not a one-off risk event, but it was one of the major one that every individual across the world faced, every business across the world faced. And as we analyze the global and systemic risks, we believe that, or our analysis of global systemic risk shows that businesses, governments, economies, institutions face risks at a much higher frequency. And the systemic risks basically trigger a cavalcade of individual risk elements, um, especially because the world is more interconnected through the global supply chains, the travel, the trade, and hence we believe that both the frequency and the magnitude of various individual risks will only continue to increase and will continue to plague firms. Now, for example, we have been, or rather, we are in between a global chip shortage, and that's impacting multiple industries. We have experienced low supplies of essentials because of an accident in the Suez Canal. Now, the bottom line is that uh, risks, organizations will continue to face risk. And only the firms that are focused on baking resilience into their businesses have sustained and will continue to sustain or grow. Um, rest all the businesses will see dips. And in our research, as I referred to, very early on, what is business resilience? We also went ahead and identified that there are 7 key pillars to resilient business. First and foremost, I'll just name those 7 key pillars, and we'll kind of discuss as we go on further. The first is the business continuity planning. The question is, do firms or have firms developed business continuity plans? Um, Understanding of strategic risks. So to say, the pillar is strategic risk management. Dependable IT. How reliable, flexible are the technology services? Number 4, automation. How quickly, that will define how quickly can the firms respond to specific events. Number 5 is employee experience. Number 6, the supply chain risk management. And supply chain isn't just necessarily around the physical goods and shipment that impact a business. It's today also about the software supply chain, and we have seen incidents of that happening in the past. Number 7, it is crisis and incident management. Now, to keep the focus and to kind of close on my answer, I would emphasize that dependable IT is an important pillar of strength for any resilient business. Those who can turn around the business or weather the storms can do so with the technology support.
Thanks, Naveen. So Girish, let's hear from you. What are your thoughts around this, and what are your observations over the last year around business resiliency?
Yeah, Brian, right. I mean, as Naveen pointed out, business resiliency is all about getting the organization into that mode of thinking how to deal with a crisis, right? So what we've seen in the past 1 year, right, is especially dealing or being in the business of disaster recovery for about 40 years. We saw a dip in the number of tests that were done by our customers. That was quite visible in the first 2 quarters of the business. And then slowly people started adopting remote testing, right? People started doing more tests being remote at an offsite location. They quickly adopted their plans. So that actually teaches us, or that tells us that resiliency has been there with us in some form or factor in the human evolution. We just need to apply it to the business logics and make sure that we are prepared for it. So that was one. The second one was, we also realized that we had built our business models. For example, a lot of companies built follow the sun model, right? Where operations was taking care of, certain aspects in certain geographies using follow the sun model. When this one thing hit us, people definitely realized that it could affect all the global teams, like Naveen pointed out. And then how do we make sure that we are working on lesser number of resources, doing much more effective job, communicating what we are actually doing and being more effective? That was also one thing that we definitely saw what customers or what businesses actually adopted to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, how has business resilience plans evolved and really, adapted or been adopted rather over the last 12 to 18 months? What's your observations around the resilience plans, the business resilience plans? Naveen?
Yeah, I can start on that. I think it would help us understand if we kind of go through the most recent impact of COVID and just take that as the baseline to understand what changes have the organizations made. So we find that based on our research, we find that the firms fall into one of the three categories as a result of this pandemic, which impacted almost every firm globally. So the firms fall into either one of the three categories. First, the survival, the firms that were surviving. Second, adaptive, organizations that adapted to the new model, to the new mode of working, to the new way of serving customers, and so on. And the third category is are the companies that were in the growth phase. So keeping the focus on the companies in the growth phase, because that can tell us, teach us some of the best practices. So for those that saw growth, it didn't come by virtue of being in the industry that they were in. Um, they grew because they had kept the focus on almost all of the 7 fundamental pillars that I talked about as part of the business resilience, or if not all, many foundational elements of a resilient business. And we do see that the firms are increasing the impetus on improving the resilience posture, if you will, as a learning out of this experience. I can bring some success stories or examples of firms that have thrived as they continued the focus and they were able to either increase the emotional appeal to their customers. For example, Adidas pivoted the 3D printing technology it used for making performance footwear to now build or manufacture 3D printed face shields for the healthcare workers, right? So turning around the business in the moment of need to what matters the most to their customer was important. The second example is coming from organization in the manufacturing industry. For example, this is not a new learning, by the way. This is a learning from a decade-old tsunami in Japan. Uh, Nissan was able to return back to normal production within a month, whereas its competitors like Toyota, Honda, they needed roughly like 3 to 4 quarters to recover from that tsunami, and that led them to lose billions of dollars. Uh, Another interesting example came from the Jacobi Medical Center in New York City that invited the US Army to participate in a simulation to set up triage tents in its parking lots to basically test its ability to handle a sudden influx of patients roughly 6 months before the COVID actually hit. Right. So that's like preparing itself for any sudden shift that an organization, any business can see. And we also see that organizations that grew kept their focus on serving the customers, keeping their privacy intact. For example, Zoom was very early on in COVID. Zoom was heavily criticized for its poor security and privacy features, and they in fact lost out on a number of corporate customers. But turning the story, Zoom put a code freeze for roughly 90 days to bolster its security and privacy features and win back customers. And during that time, you would realize that Zoom grew its user base roughly 20 times. So keeping the focus on not just serving the increasingly user load, but also ensuring that the security and privacy are the topmost priority for its customers, Zoom was able to address that challenge of that customer requirement as well. Um, Now we may say, yeah, these are good examples of what we have seen in the industry, but where do resilient businesses land? What do they gain? Uh, at Forrester, we also focus on what we call as a future fit research. identifying what organizations do to be prepared for future. And as part of that research, we find that the firms with more mature resilience practices have grown at roughly 2.4 times their industry averages. So that's good for the employees, that's good for the shareholders, that's good for the investors, and so on and so forth, right? Customers love them. That's why they grow. So that's the ultimate objective, with which organizations are running their operations, and hence, if they keep the businesses resilient, and they're able to better serve multiple constituents.
Some great data points and success stories there around business resilience and those plans evolving and being better adopted. Girish, what have been your observations over the last year or so?
Yeah, so again, right, I mean, so where, as Naveen has pointed out, right, when the broader strategy and broader aspects of what has changed in the industry, what I can give you is what we have seen within the DR tests or the business resiliency plans that we have seen from our customers' perspective. So a lot of, I think what I touched upon earlier, DR testing in itself was a big exercise that customers, did all by coming to a data center where it was a big planned activity. People's teams quickly adopted to doing all of this remote. The other thing that has drastically changed in the last 12 or 18 months is how people connect to their businesses, right? Earlier, it was all coming through a site-to-site VPN. People were all in one office trying to go in. And that is how even business resilience plans were built. People were always assuming that business resiliency will involve, hey, you know what, teams are not able to access the data center, but they are still sitting at the same location. And that has quickly changed because the data center was all intact. It was the people who got disturbed. So business resilience in terms of how people are now communicating not only to the data center, to the applications, but even between themselves, between the teams. And this excellent platform that we have got now, which is Microsoft Teams, right, is the evolution which talks about how people are connecting to their businesses. How have they adopted to making sure that applications that they had, the business resiliency part that they had, adopts to that. So that has drastically changed. And one thing that it has brought to the forefront is to think about resiliency in all aspects. And communication is one of the key aspects of business resilience, right? It talks about how do we make sure that if something happens in terms of could be a downtime at data center, could be an error, could be an outage, could be anything, what is to be communicated across the teams, which include our partners, could be our suppliers. So that has been quickly adopted, and that's some great success that we have seen in how business resiliency has evolved in the last 12 to 18 months, Brian.
Thanks, Girish. Naveen, let's talk about IT resilience. How and where does IT resilience start to play, a broader business resilience? So we talked about communication, just as Girish had mentioned, the use cases you had, focusing on IT resilience playing in that broader business resilience plan.
So I would say that dependable IT is an important pillar for a resilient business, right? So think about all the examples that I gave earlier. One of the common underlying denominator for firms across all the growth category have been that they depend on technology to change the course as and when needed. To put it in another words, no business can operate without technology. And as such, technology is an integral piece for any business operations. While we say so, it's also development in the tech ecosystem that is kind of pushing the needle in terms of firms looking at resilient businesses, resilient technology, dependable technology. And that has come as an influence of, I can say, hyperscalers for that matter have raised the bar and the expectations that technology can be available 24/7. It can be always on virtually limitless capacity with resilient architectures. And that is pushing businesses, that is pushing organizations, those who may not have been customers of hyperscalers, for example, right? And now they are also forced because their competitors are able to better serve their customers. And hence, technology resilience of IT is becoming even more important. And it's not just the resilience by means of ability to withstand failures. It also means that organizations now need to maintain a zero trust security posture, because security is an increasingly important element of downtime, right? So ensuring that organizations serve the customers and employees with privacy becomes an important imperative. Now, to master this pillar of dependable IT, I think that tech leaders or technology executives have to shift their organizational focus to new application design patterns, new architectures, new infrastructure technologies that lend themselves to build dependable technology by design, right? And that's a focus that we see across our customer base.
Girish, your comments on this, where IT resilience starts to play it in the broader business resilience.
Yeah, this is one of my favorites, right? And I'll use what had been used as Clive Humbley. He rightly quoted about a decade ago, right? Is data is the new age oil. And if you look at it, and being in Houston, I'm closer to oil and gas industries, right? So the amount of security and resiliency planning that goes into an oil and gas company, right? To use an example, right? I was going to one of the offices to visit a friend, and they have that you have to have your cars parked reverse. So in case there is an emergency, there is no time spent actually getting out. So that's the planning that went into the new, the oil and gas planning, right? Where they even made sure that their parked cars are how they are parked. So that's the way I look at it. If data is the new oil, and if IT infrastructure is hosting all of your oil, you got to make sure that it is much more resilient. You got to make sure that you have your plans built in such a way that there is no possibility of it going down. So I always think about it as, it is one of the foundation elements of business resiliency, right? Because businesses depend heavily on data, as Naveen pointed out. And if I look at it, IT resiliency is the foundation. On top of that, we talk about application resiliency, where how do applications resolve? And then we talk about business resiliency as the third level, encompassing everything else that we have talked about so far. So IT, for me, is the foundational pillar of how you should start thinking from inside out. Definitely, there has to be an outside in thinking as well, in terms of thinking about the business and then going into IT. But there is also an aspect of think about IT. What are you going to do with the data? How much data is important? What are you going to do and recover those applications on, and then use it for your business to make sure that it is resilient?
Just a reminder to our guests, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, raise your hand virtually, and I can call on you. You can ask your question live to our panelists here. Moving on, I'm going to skip to this question and talk a little bit about the difference between proactive and reactive IT resilience. Naveen, could you elaborate a little bit on the difference between those, compare and contrast proactive and reactive IT resilience?
So first and foremost, I would say that if organizations want to think about IT resilience, it has to be proactive. There's no reactive IT resilience. Now, as I said, I think this question also opens up the door for possibilities. And I typically tend to challenge or question the status quo and the prevailing practices. Based on my research and my findings, I can share an example with you that, for example, the organizations that typically invest, all organizations, I shouldn't use a subset here. Organizations do invest in backup and recovery technologies for data infrastructure, application services, and so on and so forth. One of the questions that I've always asked them is, you're making a lot of investment, but do you know what is the probability of recovery? And I call that as recovery readiness or recovery readiness index. And the question kind of goes further. Do you know when you need it, you would be able to recover no matter what? The responses that I hear back have not been very positive. And from that perspective, I call that visibility as proactive resilience. And to close on my response, whatever else the organizations do after the fact is reactive. They kind of scramble. No one has a plan of what to do next, what sequence to follow, who to communicate with, who not to communicate with, and so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
I would not qualify that as resilience in any which ways.
Yeah. Especially if they're hit with a ransomware. So
That's a topic onto itself. Yes. Especially if their organizations are hit by a ransomware attack, they have no way. There are no plans, so to say, that are proactively built, and hence organizations take months together to recover.
correct.
But I mean, this was reasonable for you, right? There's no reactive resilience. Resilience is proactive.
Exactly.
And we believe the key to being proactive is testing, right? You don't want to find out your DR plan has not been adjusted to changes in your environment when you actually have the disaster. That's way too late, right? And usually companies test once or twice a year, which is just not good enough to keep up with all the changes in your environment, right? And I would call that reactive. If you want to be proactive, you actually have to test more. And we see this all the time with our customers having an annual test and getting fully surprised by all the things that happen in that test and the changes they didn't put in their DR plan. So we recommend to have testing basically on a monthly base. And that sounds harsh and is tough on companies because they don't have the resources to do a full-blown DR test every month. But that is where service providers comes in, right? Where they can provide you with a fully automated test procedure every month, which is not just the failover itself. It is the validation that comes after the failover to automate that process and show you in a report where the validation failed, what issues you have, where you need updates in your DR plan. And along with that report, you should also get your actual RTO, right? What Naveen said, how many people really know what the actual RTO is. And if you get that on a monthly base, you actually can track and compare it to your previous months and use that as a KPI, how resilient you are.
Mm. Good. So someone mentioned a hot topic, right, in ransomware. So when it comes to business resilience around cyber attacks or events and the changes customers need to make to their business resilience plans due to a cyber event, Naveen, what are your comments around these cyber attacks? How to prepare, and testing, as Mickey was just talking about. What are some of your observations and research that you can share?
Absolutely. So first thing first, for the audience, maybe I'm not repeating anything, by making this statement as you're already experiencing, but for those who are not experiencing, ransomware attacks are becoming more prevalent, much more prevalent than ever, than what they were last month, than what they were last year, than what they were 5 years ago. Today, if I look at the statistics that we collect as part of our yearly survey development, ransomware is the one of the top 2 leading causes of business outages, as you can see on this slide.
Wow.
So we surveyed the DR professionals or DR program owners, IT leaders, call them whatever, but specifically those who were responsible for, or those who are responsible for managing the DR operation. And we asked them, if you faced an outage in the last 3 years, those who said yes, a follow-up question was, what was the cause of outage? And for those who said they faced an outage, 24% of them cited ransomware as the cause. The second pillar that you see on this slide. Now, if I look today, by the way, this survey was done like towards the end of 2019, published in 2020, but 1.5 years fast forward to today, I have no reason not to believe that ransomware is the leading cause of outage. And here is some data point for you. I just collected the number of, or looked at my news feed on June the 2nd to find out how many cases are reported, ransomware cases are reported. And as you can see, there are 4 cases reported, which is much more than I would expected. And there are many more that actually go unreported. I'll make 2 statements here about the ransomware attacks and the outages caused as a result of that. It is important for firms to realize that a ransomware attack, a recovery from a ransomware attack, is far more time consuming, far more difficult than an outage caused by a natural incident or a system failure. More importantly, the probability of getting the data back is very low in a ransomware attack. The second thing that I want to make the audience aware is that it is not the sole responsibility of the backup or the DR professionals to recover during a ransomware attack, because it is a security incident. They have to work with their security peers to develop a commonly understood, mutually agreed upon plans that are purpose built for ransomware recovery. I can go into details why a purpose built plan for ransomware recovery, right? These plans are built or are very different from a system recovery or a natural calamity cost outage. Another element that I want to point out here is that you see the yellow arrow. While there were only 4 incidents, ransomware incidents reported on June 2nd, but people are only allowed to report as much. And hence you see that only 24% said, oh, it caused an outage for us, right? But if we were to look at today, ransomware would probably shift left to be the topmost reason of outages today.
Girish and Mickey, what is your response to this information? What you're seeing and observing and working with our customers, whether recovering backup plans and DR, what are your responses to all of that?
So even customers who believe they have a DR plan need to look at 2 major areas. The first one is your backup or your disaster recovery journal safe? And the second one we see is retention of backup and your DR journal. So first on the part, is your data safe, right? Because new cyber attacks target not just your machines and encrypt your original files. They know that their nemesis is the backup. So they target the backup and try to manipulate it and try to destroy it, right? And so you need to take better care of this and need to follow the 3-to-1 rule, which means 3 copies of your data, 2 different storage or media types where your data is on, and at least 1 offsite. And the offsite is key here, as what we believe having your data offsite with a service provider like Sungard is the same as having an air gap solution. So now you have the data offsite, you know they cannot get to that. You also need to ask your service provider, can you fully recover me from that data? So just putting it offsite isn't enough. You need to make sure you can fully recover from there and have an actual DR plan for that. And then on the topic of retention, you need to look how long you keep data for your disaster recovery plan, for your instant recovery. We see that sometimes it's just a day. Some technologies have 24 hours as their standard journal. We at least have 3 days, but even that people need to look at and say, how long will it take me to identify I've been attacked? And how long will it take to make a decision to actually fail over and go to the DR side or bring back the backup. Those decisions sometimes take much longer than you think. And once you arrived at that decision, you have to look the time it was. If that was longer than your data retention, you have a problem now, because now you can assume that all your data is corrupted, even the one from your backups or your DR. So you need to look at, do I need to increase those retention times? Do you need to keep data for a longer time? Do I need something like a golden copy over time that's proven, that's tested, and is always my one point I can fail back and recover from? Those are the areas we see that companies who have a plan need to take a second look now.
Yeah, and just to top on that, right? I mean, I know we've always talked when it comes to ransomware recovery, right? We've always talked about, hey, you know what, could happen to you, right? But just want to give everybody a note here that in the last year, we also saw some success stories where people did recover from that, right? We had a couple of disasters declared because of this, and we had great success stories in terms of how customers reacted to it and how they quickly adopted to what was going to be their ransomware recovery. So whether it was planned, whether it was they had a full-blown plan for it or no, there were success stories. So it's not something that is impossible to do, right? It is something that we all can achieve. It's just something that we need to make sure that we look at it, plan for it, and then execute on it. That way, we all know we are protected in case we have this kind of a ransomware or a cyber attack, or we are a victim of it in any aspect, and we just need to plan for it.
Great. My final questions, and we'll certainly leave some time for any questions if there are any. Many solutions only focus on the operating system level. Naveen, how important is it that application recovery and validation in all of this?
I think that's a great question from a technology standpoint. And let's take an example of, let's say, an e-commerce site. And as we know, an e-commerce site isn't just about building a catalog, pricing, presenting the products, and providing the best price on the website, but it is also about a number of other things. For example, how do you attach more sales? So there is a recommendation engine that comes into the picture. What if I have sold the product and my only channel of service is online? How do I take returns? Right. So there are a number of stages in the whole customer life cycle that need to be managed, again, through the operations, whether you do that through your website or you have brick and mortar stores to basically support your customer life cycle stages. It's important that we look at recovery from an application or a business process standpoint. And let me take another example. When I talk of a business process, let's say you're a financial services company, and let's say you're a credit card company. To be even more precise, and you have a promotional campaign saying, "Hey, 2 minutes approved," or 2 minutes approval for your new credit card. And there comes a new request, and God forbids that was the time you were hit, and you faced an outage. You started to recover. Your few VMs, few application modules have recovered. But as it relates to a credit approval, it's not just about one application taking a decision by itself. There's a chain of applications that connect together. And many a times, it's not just your application. You're also taking services from third-party agencies like, Experian, TransUnion, and who not. So let's say all your applications were recovered, but the application component that connects to a third party for validation and getting the credit score and credit check and whatnot, that piece didn't work. So that's an Achilles heel in your business process. Now you can't support your 2-minute credit approval, marketing material that you were out with. Right. So hence, in my view, a recovery shouldn't be just viewed at recovery from infrastructure or recovery of a particular application module, but recovery should be looked at from a complete business process standpoint.
Koresh, Mickey, anything to add there around focusing beyond just the operating system level, but looking at application recovery, and then to tack onto that, the value of having a trusted service provider provide that support.
Yeah. So again, right. I mean, as I said earlier, right. It should be looked upon as a 3-layer stack, right? It's IT resiliency, so you gotta have your data recovered, your operating system recovered, but then you also have to focus on, and in today's world where everything is getting hybrid, and now we are moving out of this one data center, one rack, going into a SaaS provider, connecting and using application A from provider A, and then that application connects it to something else, like, for example, Salesforce integration, the Office 365 integration. Just to tack on Naveen's example, right? Think about an ordering system for a retailer has an order system based, let's say, in a physical data center, but the email that goes out to a customer is probably coming from Office 365. So our look cannot be that I recovered my data center, that I recovered my OS there. We have to look at how did we actually identify that we have a dependency on Office 365 or Salesforce, and then how does that play into the picture of application recovery? So you have to almost think about as a business process, like Naveen pointed out, and think about building that. And to just talk on, as to how can service providers help, right? With more and more things getting agile, getting hybrid, having that third person look at it from an application perspective. A lot of times when we go into discussions, we realize that IT teams or application teams have looked at their application in a silo, right? They have looked at it as saying, hey, this is what I do. This is what the application does. So this is what I treat it as an application. But giving it that broader look of saying, hey, how do users use it? How do my customers use that application? How do we make value out of that application? That's the view that I think service providers can give. And to mention about Mickey, right? I mean, using that as a trusted advisor and using your service provider to do more testing absolutely can bring value to the relationship, is what I think. Any closing thoughts on that, Naveen?
I will certainly add that, yeah, while I've given you my view on the recovery piece and validation and so on, I think it is important that organizations look at service providers as a trusted partner, if you will. And why so? I have worked with a number of organizations through consulting projects, talked to their organizations on how well staffed is the DR program team.
Mm-hmm.
So very common, we find that the DR program is severely understaffed. So what that means, as a result, you may overlook some of the risks, business or technology risks, that you should otherwise consider as part of your tech or business resiliency plans. And that's where I think service providers who have got experience, exposure to the best practices, and those who understand risks and have proven practices, can be a support, can be an extended team, if you will, and they can be on your side as it relates to understanding the risks, developing some risk mitigation plans, or maybe not addressing specific risk because the probability of that risk happening is probably very low, or the return on investment if you invest on addressing that risk may be very low, right? And hence, doing that classification, understanding the risk, developing risk mitigation plans, executing on those risks, as you pointed out earlier, becomes very important. And for an understaffed team, which is a common occurrence, I think that the service providers can certainly come as an extended team, which is on your side to support various stages of your resiliency life cycle, if you will.
Mm. Thanks, Naveen. last call, questions live from the audience. Anyone that's a guest here have a question for our panel guests?
No questions in the chat.
Okay. Well, I want to thank today's speakers. Thank you all who have joined us today. This was a great discussion. Today's discussion will be available. We did record it. We'll put it up on our website, www.sungardas.com. Each attendee will also receive a link to the recording when we post. To learn more from Naveen, read his blog on Forrester's website. You can follow him on LinkedIn or on Twitter as well. And make sure to check out Sungard AS's blog as well. And we put out podcasts and talk about these topics. Our podcast is called IT Availability Now. You can find them in any of the podcast players of your choice. But thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was very useful. Thank you.